It's so easy to be average. It takes a little something to be special, doesn't it? It takes a little something special to be a great player. Did you push yourself to be great today?
There wasn't a first down. Not that much. The officiating, I'm bitterly disappointed with the officiating today. That spot, the graphic displays the NFL penalties. The one not called on us on that day clearly was being booked to that day. And the previous penalty they called on Delano Hill, the ball is uncatchable and by the receiver. See, I'm bitterly disappointed. Throw a hat, throw a stick, throw a siren, that's a penalty.
This is the Silver Bullets Podcast on the Ozone Radio Network, your authority on all things Ohio State. Here are your hosts, Shannon Sommers and Chip Minnich.
Not Chip, if you have an iota of human feeling.
Buckeye Nation, welcome to another edition of Silver Bullets Podcast here on the Ozone Radio Network. I'm your host, Shannon Sommers, contributor at Hazen Cannon and producer of Acosta Field with Tony Gerdeman. We're going to be talking about college football today, which means we're going to have the Chip Minnich, the man, the myth, the legend of Silver Bullets Podcast. Chip, you can find his work on Hazen Cannon and also Athlon Sports. Chip, how are we doing today, my man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for that wonderful intro. It's always great to be with you, Shannon.
Right, as we said, this is the college football show, so we are going to be talking about the Big Ten Championship. Congratulations to Ohio State. We're going to be talking about if this is a successful season or not for the Buckeyes, and a little bit about the bowl game, but just we'll get more into the bowl games later. We're going to be talking about the decision of the College Football Playoff Committee. We have two great guests on. We have Kevin McGuire of NBC College Football Talk and No2MinuteWarning.com. That's his podcast. We also have Brett Ciancia of Pick Six Previews and Triple Option Podcast going to be, joining us, which I think is going to be great. And then we have, before our bowls, we have one last game to pick for our Pick'em segment.
Badgers first down to the Ohio State 18. Hornibrook to sling it. Plants, looks, throws long on the right side, and it's intercepted by Denzel Ward. Down at the 2-yard line as he jumped in front of Fumagalli, the tight end. And Denzel Ward, junior cornerback, comes up with his second interception of the year. 1st and 10, Ohio State with the football at their own 16. Empty backfield for J.T. Barrett, who has 4 wide to the left. Barrett now from his 9. Fires middle of the field, going down toward McLaurin. Caught at the 5. McLaurin to the Wisconsin 30. Right side to the 20, to the 10, and the Indianapolis native, Terry McLaurin, has taken it into the end zone for an 84-yard Ohio State touchdown, getting the Buckeyes on the board first, 6-0. 2nd and 10, Ohio State at their own 43-yard line. J.T. Barrett in the shotgun. Mike Weber to his left in the backfield. Snap to Barrett. Screens it left side. Paris Campbell, 43. Campbell loose to the 50, to the Wisconsin 40. Campbell left sideline to the Badger 20-yard line, to the 10, to the 5, and Paris Campbell takes it to the house on a screen pass play that goes 57 yards for the score. J.T. Barrett to Paris Campbell, and Ohio State leads 13-7. 1st and goal. Ohio State to the Wisconsin 1. Tight end ball, motioning on the right. Barrett in the shotgun with a snap. Barrett straight ahead into the end zone for the touchdown. J.T. Barrett, his 10th rushing touchdown of 2017. He blew past lineman Connor Sheehy, and it is a 20-7 Ohio State lead. 4th and 20, Badgers of their own 47. Hornibrook gets the snap. Drops back at his 37. Hornibrook fires middle of the field, and it's intercepted by Ohio State. Damon Webb goes down at the 29-yard line as he picked it off in the middle of the field. Damon Webb, senior safety, with his 4th interception of the year. And Ohio State's got to burn 1:09 off the clock to win a Big Ten title.
The following highlight clips are courtesy of Paul Keels on the Ohio State IMG Radio Network. All right, Buckeye Nation, as we know, this past weekend we went to Big Ten Championship game. We had the Ohio State. They looked strong. They came out, I thought they came out pretty strong, but then JT had some miscues and a pick six and allowed Wisconsin to hang around, and Wisconsin made it very interesting, even with the 10-minute delay of the turf. So, Chip, I'll let you go ahead and talk about the Wisconsin game.
Well, congratulations to Ohio State for winning the Big Ten championship, their first outright Big Ten championship since the national championship year of 2014. So that's something to be recognized. I think most Ohio State fans are still kind of reconciling the fact that they're not going to the college football playoff, but maybe I'm old fashioned. Maybe I'm just being overly nostalgic about the past, but I think anytime defeating that team up north, regardless of whether it's on the road like this year or at home, and winning the Big Ten championship still means a great deal. Ohio State is going to be going to the Cotton Bowl to face a familiar bowl opponent in USC, and it seems more of like a Rose Bowl than a Cotton Bowl, but again, a quality opponent on December 29th should be a great game. But getting back to the Wisconsin game, I think Wisconsin also has a lot to be proud of. I thought they battled back. There were certainly opportunities. Shannon, you alluded to. JT Barrett was not very precise throughout the game, but Wisconsin did everything they could to keep pace with Ohio State. And yes, Ohio State was sloppy. We kind of alluded to the fact that Ohio State was inconsistent this season. That was an example of that inconsistency on Saturday night. But I want to give credit where credit is due. I thought Wisconsin, they did what they could to keep pace with Ohio State. And I'm just glad that Ohio State came on the winning end, 27-21, to emerge as the 2017 Big Ten champions.
Yeah, I agree with you. Congratulations to the Buckeyes. With the adversity of the Illinois game, the Oklahoma game, the adversity, especially this past week for the defensive side of the ball with the Greg Schiano stuff and staying focused and shutting down Jonathan Taylor and making life for Alex Hornibrook, miserable. And that offensive line for Wisconsin, it was nice to see Ohio State come out with the win, a successful season, because as you mentioned, beating Michigan, anytime you beat Michigan and you win, the Big Ten title, that's a successful year. You've got a New Year's Six bowl. Yes, it would have been nice to get to the playoffs, but this doesn't mean to me, I don't care how many whatever star players and all that kind of hoopla, that was an unsuccessful season. You got to look at the whole, and not just the little bit of what didn't happen. I mean, it's, as they say with the row the boat, or you make your bed, you lay in it. It is what it is. And unfortunately, and nothing against the playoff committee, because there's a case for Ohio State to be made in order to be able to get in there. And there's a case for Alabama to be in there. I don't know. I mean, to me, and we'll talk about this later, but to me, it seems like there's an opportunity missed for college football, and I could be just, out of my mind, but I think it would have been something to be able to sit there and say, hey, Alabama, you know what? Sure, you beat Mercer 56-0, but scheduling an FCS team is as bad as losing 30 points to a 7-5 conference opponent. I mean, I could be wrong in that regard, but that's just the way I feel about it. We said before the season started that Ohio State was going to win the Big Ten East. That happened. We said Wisconsin was going to win the West. That happened. We said Ohio State was going to win the Big Ten title. That happened. So congratulations to us for being right this year.
Yeah, that's something to be said.
Exactly. And it would be nice to be in the playoffs, but I mean, me personally, and part of the old school thing, and it kind of stinks that we're not able to play in a Rose Bowl because, like you said, this is a Rose Bowl type of game. And if it wasn't for the college playoffs, then Ohio State and USC would be playing. I mean, it would have been a lot cooler if both teams were in the playoffs too, but hey, you know what? It is what it is, and I'm not going to sit there and worry about it and just enjoy the bowl season, because before you know it, we're going to be here without college football, and we're going to be sitting there in January, February, March, April, May, June, waiting, like, please start already, going crazy. So, I mean, let's, before we get into our talk about the college football playoffs and everything, I just want to get your thoughts on, you hear a lot of people saying that maybe we should have a 8-team playoff, and maybe this is something to where if you have the New York Six Bowls, you can have something like that, and you would have a USC Ohio State in the playoffs right now. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, to be completely fair, I've always been an advocate of including as many conference champions as possible. I've always been, maybe it's just because there's something even before the BCS about where you're voting on a champion. I've always been a staunch advocate of the game. The champion should be decided by the play on the field. So the fact that the BCS was a step in the right direction, and then we've come up to the college football playoff with 4 teams. I've always been a believer in an 18 playoff. To be quite honest, I think anytime any of the conference champions should be involved, regardless of, I realize, you're probably thinking, okay, like the Sun Belt, the MAC. Yes, I'm including it, those other conference champions. I think they should, if they get blown out, they get blown out. But I think the idea of you win your conference championship that you should be in. But getting back to the whole idea of an 18 playoff, I'm not sure if you had an opportunity to see it, but I thought Dan Wetzel of Yahoo Sports, who was the author of Death of the BCS, the day after Ohio State was excluded from the college football playoff, he had an excellent article. For those of you who haven't seen it, look it up. Dan Wetzel argued about how an 18 playoff could work with the idea of all of the conference champions, the five power conference champions would get an automatic bid. One of the non-AQ conference champions, so in this case, like this year would be, Central Florida, for example, and then you could still have a couple of at-large bids. The idea of the first round of the playoffs being held on campus, so for example, I think in the article, Ohio State would have to travel to play Alabama, play a game down there in Tuscaloosa, or vice versa. Like there would be years where, a team from the South would have to come up north. I think that would be tremendous for the sport. I think that would be exactly what, in terms of like the great equalizer, regardless of whether we're talking having to travel north, travel south, whatever it might be. But the idea that you're settling it on the field, nothing against the College Football Playoff Committee. I think they're doing as well as they can with what they have. But I just believe that if you win your conference championship, regardless of whether it's a game or if it's just settled through the standings, however it's done, I think that you should be thrown into the ring to settle it on the field, so to speak, and determine who is the best team in college football.
Now, see, I'm old school, and I know you're old school too. But I've always been a firm believer, especially after all the years of watching Ohio State lose out on the possibility of playing a national championship. Rightfully so. I'm not disagreeing that it wasn't right. But all the years of having great teams and losing out to Michigan. Now, in the 80s, if you had this, in the 90s, if you had this playoff, then how many times will we see Ohio State and Florida State battling in the national championship possibility? But that being said, I was a guest on the Mark Rogers show, or Mark Rogers TV, last weekend, right before the Wisconsin game. And we talked about the, possibility of an 18 playoff. And at that time, I made comments of that losing the last week of the season should, disqualify you based on what's happened in the past. That if you lose your conference championship game, that you should be excluded. So I'm against having an 8-team playoff based on that criteria, that they should throw that criteria in there. Now, yeah, having your, being a conference champion should automatically put you into the playoffs. And Penn State got screwed on that last year. And I'm not saying Ohio State got screwed on that this year because whatever. But I mean, maybe there is something to where in the future we could sit there and look at, and this is just a hypothetical, to where you have a 12-team playoff and that starts week 1 with the conference championships. That's going to give you 10 teams right there. And then you're going to pick 2 of the top 10 or, 2 of the best teams, say in the group of 5. And if maybe, like whatever championship game is the best, or I don't know how you figure that one out. But, and then you just, from that, you would have your, 6 teams would come out of that. I don't know. There's a bunch of different things, and they're not going to change it for a while. It's a 12-year contract, and this is only, year number 4, I believe it is. So we're not going to see any changes, but it's fun to talk about. It's fun to debate. And this is what makes college football so enjoyable.
You are correct. And as you said, just to echo what you said earlier, for those college football fans, Ohio State fans in particular, who I've heard, or I should say a little more accurately, have read online, well, I'm going to boycott college football because I'm not going to watch the games, on New Year's Day because Ohio State was excluded. Just think about, what Shannon said, okay, so you're going to deprive yourself of the sport that you probably love the most. You're not going to see it. Now, granted, we have the spring game, and Ohio State fans always come out for the spring game sometime in April. It hasn't been announced yet, but you're going to deprive yourself of, the sport that you love the most for a good 8 months out of spite. Who are you truly hurting here? So, yeah, it's disappointing. Congratulations to Alabama, for being selected. I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised that Ohio State was excluded. And I'm looking forward to the Cotton Bowl on December 29th, and I think everyone else should be too.
I think it's going to be a great game. I mean, we're going to get into more of that next week or the week after, whatever hell all this shakes out, especially with the holidays rolling around. But we're definitely going to have at least 1 or 2 shows, I'm thinking. I have to look at the schedule. But definitely have to get, we'll definitely be talking about it and getting somebody from USC. I think this is going to be a really, really good game. And, hey, I would say, hey, Cleveland Brown fans, you might be able to see, somebody on the field that the Browns can draft, but we know that the Browns won't be watching any of that game because Ohio State's in it. So I think Sam Darnold's getting screwed. All right, Buckeye Nation. We're going to discuss the fallout from the college football playoff committee's choices of what they did, where they'll put everybody, and stuff like that. So today we're going to have Kevin McGuire from NBC College Football Talk and No 2 Minute Warning joining us. Kevin, how are we doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on. It's good to talk to you guys again. Definitely.
We also have Brett Ciancia from Pick Six Previews. And for some reason, I forgot to write it down, and I'm having a Blanca. What's your podcast called again?
It's the Triple Option Podcast.
That's right.
But at Fix Previews on Twitter.
Obviously, a lot of fans across the country are laughing at Ohio State and calling Ohio State a bunch of crybabies. But, I mean, the way I look at this, the fallout from it, I kind of understand where the committee's coming from. You can't shake off that Iowa loss, but there's other things you have to look at. And, I mean, Brett, we'll start off with you. I mean, what are your thoughts on putting Alabama in over Ohio State, or even for that matter, a USC or somebody else?
Yeah, I think to me personally, it was coming down to kind of a 50-50 call for the committee. In my opinion, I was actually leaning Ohio State, but I knew it was going to be kind of a coin flip. The reason I was leaning Ohio State in this case was because the committee had apparently showed us throughout the season that wins mattered more than losses. The way they were surging Auburn up there, even with their 2 losses, it seemed that they were valuing wins more. And, of course, Ohio State with 3 wins, better than Bama's best win, and the conference championship card. I thought that would sway the vote there. But, it could have gone either way. Once you lose that second game, it kind of opens it up and takes it out of your control. So I guess I'm okay with it. Could have gone either way, though.
Yeah, I understand where the playoff committee's coming from as far as maybe the conference championship, and who else better to ask than Kevin about this, especially since the Penn State Nittany Lions last year were bypassed for Ohio State. But at the same time, I do believe it was because Ohio State had a better resume and a better strength of schedule as for the reason why they got, they jumped the Nittany Lions. Kevin, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, going back to last year, I actually think the conversation was more about Penn State versus Washington for that 4th spot, because I always felt like Ohio State, resume-wise, they had the major wins and they only had 1 loss, so they were definitely worthy of being in the playoff last year. So I think when you were comparing Washington and Penn State, that's a little bit of a different situation. But going forward into this season, I think we're all sort of on the same page. I think we got to read there. We were thinking that there was a case to be made for Ohio State, but on the other side, there was a case to be made for Alabama. And I don't think there was one decision that was clearly more correct than the other. And I know there's a lot of frustration if you're an Ohio State fan, probably, but I think it all comes down to, first of all, it starts with how many losses have you had? And then you start to drive into some other conversations that, there were some pros for Ohio State, there were some cons for Ohio State, and I think the blowout loss to Iowa was just too much to overcome, I think, at that point in the season.
Now, Chip, you had an interesting article, a really good article on Athlon. Why don't you go ahead and describe or, talk about your stance on how it played out?
Well, thank you, Shannon, for the compliment. Those are always appreciated, and I'm hoping to try and equal up to the task of our fine guests here. But getting back to the Athlon article, I kind of looked at it. I mean, Shannon, you alluded to the fact that the 31-point loss. I kind of looked at not just the 31-point loss to Iowa, but it was kind of a cumulative thing. Like, kind of, if you want to take a step back, like to week 2 when Ohio State was soundly defeated by Oklahoma 31-16. If you recall, we kind of said, all right, Ohio State has little to no wiggle room after that. I mean, like, they pretty much have to win out in order to still be in the conversation. And then after being soundly defeated by Iowa, it wasn't even close. I mean, it was, Iowa was pretty much in control of the entire game. It was a steep uphill climb. So I looked at not only the blowout losses, but I also looked at the fact that Ohio State, any fair, objective Ohio State fan would have to say that by and large, Ohio State throughout the entire season was tremendously inconsistent. I mean, we were fortunate enough to have Kevin on, previewing the Penn State game. I think Kevin would agree. Even though Ohio State came back to win that game, I mean, Ohio State, they were down 14-0, before staging a furious comeback. And then when Ohio State went on the road to Ann Arbor, they were down 14-0, staged a comeback to win that game against Wisconsin. They looked like they could blow out Wisconsin, which a lot of Ohio State fans thought, all right, well, this will surely impress the playoff committee. And we all know Ohio State, they won that game, but they did not win decisively, winning 27-21. So the fact that, you had blowout losses, you had an inconsistent team. I think that led to the third aspect, and that is the speculation by the College Football Playoff Committee that, what team are we getting here? I mean, are we going to get good Ohio State, or are we going to get bad Ohio State? So I think the College Football Playoff Committee felt that Alabama, yes, they didn't win their conference, and yes, they lost their last game decisively to Auburn, but throughout the course of the season, Alabama, in their estimation, was a better team than Ohio State over the course of the season.
Now, getting two SEC teams in there, either one of two things was going to happen unless they jumped USC in there, which I think they kind of had a deserving in order to be in it. But you're going to have either a 2-loss team or you're going to have two teams from one conference, and we end up getting two SEC teams in there. The national narrative beforehand was that the SEC was going to have a down year. Is the SEC still have that clout, and is this the reason? Or, people still looking down on the Big Ten? Or, when you look at strength of schedules, a lot of them are heavily favored for Ohio State, except I think it's like the Sargent or what, I forget how to pronounce it really properly. But I think it's like 27 and 28 between Ohio State and Alabama. But everybody else seems to have Ohio State and Alabama a bigger separation. And you can't fault Alabama for the Florida State and Florida State falling off, because they did schedule somebody, a Power 5, even though it was on a neutral field. But is the perception that the SEC is still better than the Big Ten, and did that help in this situation, Kevin?
You know what? I think maybe a little bit, but I actually feel if you just look at the four teams that were included there, obviously you've got 3 one-loss conference champions, and you're pretty much going to take those one-loss conference champions from those conferences every season. Just so happened to be one of them wasn't Alabama. So I think when you look at that, and then you think that the fourth team is a one-loss Alabama. Say what you will about the SEC, but you have a one-loss conference champion. You've got a one-loss Alabama, and I think Chip was kind of hitting some of the same points that I would make. Alabama was more of a consistent team from start to finish this season. Say what you will about the strength of schedule. Say what you will about the not quite as impressive resume when it comes to signature wins. But it was a much more consistent team that was playing some good football from start to finish this season. So I think that alone is why this committee gave a little bit of a benefit of the doubt maybe to Alabama over some of the other candidates that are out there. But again, it came back to it's a one-loss team versus teams with 2 losses. So what do you value more, the wins or the losses? And I don't think there's a perfect balance there. And I think that's certainly something that played in Alabama's favor, more so than the perception of the SEC.
Now, I know a lot of people have said, or, have stated since this, and Joe Klatt's definitely one of them, and I kind of have to agree that this might be setting college football back when you look at somebody like Alabama with 8 conference games, schedule somebody like a Mercer before their rival game, which they end up losing. But Brett, I think you put something out on Twitter where I think 10 teams so far with a 8 conference game schedule have made it in, and only 4 with the 9 conference schedule or something like that. Do you think that this is something to where now ADs and head coaches are going to look at the Nick Saban way of, all right, let's get some more cream puffs in here, because honestly, a win's a win. And even if you schedule a good out of conference and you lose, and you play conference games and you lose to a decent conference team, that's going to be 2 losses. You're going to be knocked out.
Yeah. The tweet you're referencing there was, so for the ACC, the SEC, and then the first 2 years of the playoff, it was also the Big Ten had an 8 conference game slate, and all 10 of those conference champs made it. But for conferences that had a 9-game slate, only 4 out of 10 have made it, so 40% there. It's just an added grind. Hey, look at it this way. The Iowa game was a crossover this year for Ohio State. Chances are, or at least I guess a third chance that that wouldn't have even happened in the SEC or ACC's format. Not to make excuses for Ohio State, but it is definitely a lot harder to go 9 straight conference games to end the season than to break it up with a couple FCS teams. But again, with Alabama, I don't think they really went the full Baylor route, which is to schedule 4 non-Power 5 teams. So I mean, they did go out and schedule Florida State, who at the time was looking like a legit playoff contender. So I can't really fault them for that. It just shook out that way. But yeah, going back to your last question real quick, I want to get in on that was, I don't think it was necessarily a call that the SEC is still the dominant conference. I think most college football fans would be able to tell you that, hey, it's a lot more close. It's closer at the top. You can make an argument for a couple conferences there. It's not 2008 anymore, right? But I think it was more a referendum on Alabama as a program, that they have that benefit of the doubt. They dominated on signing day for a decade now, and have probably the best staff development of players too. So I think that was more a call on Alabama rather than saying definitively, hey, the SEC is the best. We need to get 2 SEC teams in here. I think it just shook out that way.
Chip, let me ask you if you want to add anything else to those other questions. And just in your thoughts, I just want to throw this out. Why, why wouldn't Wisconsin with only 1 loss make it into the, that 4th spot?
No, I think you raise an interesting question. I mean, something that we haven't brought up yet. I guess, here in this holiday season, if you want to think of it, this is more of a, something that I would ask Santa Claus, the idea that, conference championship games should count more, not less. The idea that Wisconsin, when you think about it, Wisconsin was 12-0 going into it. And the idea that if they had beaten Ohio State, it lends itself, to the question, would Wisconsin still have been on the outside looking in? It's almost as though, like, if Wisconsin hadn't played Ohio State, maybe they would have been in the playoff. You could make the same argument about Auburn. I mean, think about, Auburn decisively beat Georgia in November, and a few weeks later, Georgia turns around, does the same thing to them. But Auburn was sitting number 1, going into the SEC championship game, and now they're on the outside looking in. Now, granted, they do have 3 losses, but my point being, I think, conference championship games should count more. Wisconsin, they gave Ohio State all they could handle, throughout most of that game. They only lost by 6 points. And, Shannon, to your point, it seemed as though, they should have been given, greater benefit of the doubt. Now, granted, they wound up ranked number 6, and they're going to be playing against Miami in the Orange Bowl, so they're going to a good bowl game destination. Just to kind of, you asked me about any other points to make about this whole process. I guess to kind of mix my holidays here. Festivus is coming up, so the airing of grievances. I guess, agreements that I have legitimately is I think that should be taken into account in discussion amongst the athletic directors involved in the college football playoff is, I think, the fact that there are inconsistent scheduling practices across the conferences. I think that truly hurts. Now, I realize it sounds like sour grapes from an Ohio State fan, but Brett referenced the fact that you have 8 games versus 8 conference games versus 9 conference games. The idea that Shannon, you even referenced the idea of Alabama playing Mercer. A lot of SEC, ACC teams playing FCS opponents. I do want to, and this is going to sound like completely out of left field, want to give credit to Nick Saban, because Nick Saban has been on the record saying the SEC should play a 9-game conference schedule. Brett is absolutely correct that the 9-game conference schedule is more of a grind, but I think that would be something that I would hope is brought up in terms of, with the College Football Playoff Committee having a consistent view of, how are we going to treat teams that are scheduling FCS opponents versus those that are playing 9 conference games, the idea of the conference championship game being more. And just a final point about Alabama. I'm not sure if any of you fine gentlemen have seen this, but it was, I saw on social media earlier that Alabama's last win against an FBS opponent was on November 11th. And that was, if any of you remember that was when they had to rally to beat Mississippi State. So, congratulations to Alabama. And I think Kevin would, probably be justified in thinking, probably crying crocodile tears for us Ohio State fans after last year. But, but in all seriousness, I think, I think it came down to consistency across, looking at both teams and the fact that, Ohio State, they couldn't escape, the 31-point loss. Nick Saban did everything he could to kind of leave that question lingering in the minds of the College Football Playoff Committee.
Years past in college football, and the way it's always traditionally been, is if you lose in the last week of the season or last 2 weeks of the season, you take a major hit and you fall down in the rankings, and it throws your national championship hopes out of the window. We witnessed it, I don't know how many times, with Ohio State in the 90s, losing to Michigan. The tradition has been held throughout the BCS. It kicks people out of the BCS title game. I think using 2007 as an example, to where Ohio State was able to get into the national championship game because of the chaos that ensued that, final week. We're into the playoffs now, and we're not holding the same standard. So, to me, Brett, do you think that we should have held that same standard? And do you think if they put Ohio State in over Alabama, that not only do you hold that standard, but at the same time, now you force the, like Alabama, Auburn, and all these guys to stop playing FCS teams and to get to that 9-game conference schedule? We changed the way the Big 12 was and helped them get a championship game, and they're starting to schedule better out-of-conference games. Do you think that this would have been something to actually help college football moving forward if they put Ohio State in?
So a lot of pieces there. I think first off, I agree with all of you that it should be a uniform thing where you either have the 8 conference game slate or 9 conference game slate. Make it uniform across the board, Power 5. I do agree on that. It's also funny to look at the SEC and the ACC. Even though they have the one less conference game, they actually lead the nation in FCS matchups. So you'd expect that to be the other way around, right? You'd have the Big Ten with their grind say, hey, we need a week off, we'll do an FCS team. It's the other way around where SEC, ACC, only 8 games plus all the FCS teams too. So that's an issue. I think that's got to be corrected. But to get back to your timing question, I kind of agree with how the playoff does it now, where the timing really shouldn't matter as much. I really, over the years have been against how the coaches poll and the AP poll kind of use the ladder system, for lack of a better word, where Team A loses, they all move up one rung on the ladder. I like it more as an evolving, week to week, and really looking at the resumes as they unfold. That's why every week on Twitter I put out that wins over currently ranked top 25 teams, not what they were ranked at the time of the game, or else we'd be counting, Clemson's Louisville win, you'd be counting Alabama's Florida State win, that kind of thing. So I like how the season evolves. They're able to, and the committee has shown this, they're able to, stray away from that ladder system, that rigid, move up 1 or 2 spots each week. But I think high level, I don't know if that would have really, you said would Ohio State make the playoff, have changed the game at all? I don't think so. I think when you look back on college football, the issues that I've had were when a truly elite team gets denied a shot at the title. A couple instances like, the 2000 Miami team, they had actually beat Florida State, but that Florida State team got the nod into the BCS title game. Talk about 04 Auburn going 13-0 in the SEC and getting, undefeated and still blocked from a shot at the title. Or even maybe the 2011 Oklahoma State team that ran the table, was perfect, but lost on a Thursday night game at Iowa State in overtime right after a plane crash. Like those examples, I'd be really outraged. Here, between Alabama and Ohio State, I didn't really see a truly elite team. They had talking points each way, but they have some serious flaws each way too. So I don't think it was really a referendum on the sport as a whole.
Now, I've said on other shows of ours that for Ohio State and the Iowa loss, especially how bad it was. If they were just to lose, that'd be a different story, but the way they lost, it just was unexcusable, unacceptable. And I'm not saying that Ohio State deserved to be able to be in the playoffs. But based on strength of schedule, I thought that they should have got it over Alabama. Kevin, do you think, and that if they put Ohio State in, that, with the same questions I asked Brett, would that have improved it, or am I just, thinking in an alternate reality?
You might be a little bit in an alternate reality, because ultimately, I don't know if this is a decision one way or the other that's going to spearhead any kind of change or reaction. And I actually think it would be best to not overreact with how you're scheduling or how a conference is scheduling, and trying to figure out exactly what should be uniform, what should not be uniform between the conferences, just based on this 1 year. Now, if this is something that occurs again, then maybe we have those discussions, and that's not to say that we shouldn't have the discussions now, but I just don't feel like making any changes and making any formal policies just because of what's happening right now. I don't think that's a wise move, because I think if you could look at the Big 12 as the example, I mean, the college football playoff starts, 2 Big 12 co-champions get left out for Ohio State, and all of a sudden the Big 12 saying, well, we got to get a championship game back. Well, what happens this year? The championship game doesn't really mean anything for the Big 12 this year, because if they don't have that conference championship game, Oklahoma's still in, right? I mean, does anyone disagree with that? With the way that Oklahoma ended the season, win against Ohio State, a couple wins along the way, 1 loss Big 12 champion at the end of the year. They end up having to beat a team they've already beaten to prove that they're playoff worthy. So maybe that goes into the whole idea of, the reactionary on a week by week basis, the ladder system, as was just mentioned, and the impact of a late loss could potentially have in harming you. Ultimately, I don't know where we're going here. I mean, do we want to evaluate the whole season as a whole, put all the data points together, and really determine who are the 4 most worthy at the end of the year? And that goes into discussion: what defines the most worthy? What defines the best team? Everybody has a different opinion on that, and that's what I guess where the selection committee comes into play, because there's just so many different opinions out there on how this is all put together. So, I mean, there's pros and cons to every system. It was like this before the BCS. It was like this during the BCS. And now it's like this with the college football playoff. It's not a perfect system. There never will be a perfect system, probably. And for as long as we watch college football, how a national champion is crowned will always have room for debate, I think.
I think that's one of the greatest parts about college football, is being able to have a debate and so many people partaking in a debate, which, that helps out college football in itself. I mean, it's already a great brain and everything. I think with last year and this year, with the way the college playoff committee, chose the number 4 spots, that they not open up the door, but they showed Notre Dame, hey, look, don't worry about or even BYU, I believe also, but don't worry about having to play in the conference championship game. If you guys do really good in your schedule, chances are you're probably going to get in, which I guess a lot of fans are going to be upset about, but that's the writing's on the wall with that. But when you sit there and look at the playoff committee, and I'll ask Chip this, especially being an Ohio State guy, Gene Smith being on the committee, do you think this hurt Ohio State, or do you think it just, because if a lot of fans or if he would have gotten, or if Ohio State would have got in, then a ton of fans would have been saying that, hey, it's all because of him, but even though he didn't partake in anything. And I've heard people say, well, since he was excluded from the talk of Ohio State and relationships he has with people, that maybe they went a little bit above and beyond to show that there's no bias for him.
Well, I think you hit it right on the head. I mean, you can passionately argue for or against Gene Smith being on the college football playoff committee. I just think if it was up to me, quite honestly, I think having let's take Gene Smith out of the equation, because and I'm not as up to speed on every current member, but for example, Dan Radakovich, who is the athletic director for Clemson, he had to recuse himself. I believe Frank Beamer had to recuse himself because his son is an assistant coach. Like, I could go on. I think ideally, I think the ideal college football playoff committee is having no current athletic directors involved. I think having I would always prefer as many coaches as possible. simply because I believe maybe I'm in the minority here, amongst the four of us, but there was something to be said about, when Barry Alvarez, when he was on the playoff committee in previous seasons, I believe he said something to the effect of, I can look at a schedule and kind of, determine what the intent was there. We referenced, for example, Baylor having a tendency to schedule cupcakes throughout their non-conference schedule. So I'm not entirely sure if, as far as, how you rectify that. But, I just think Gene Smith, damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think, Ohio State was kind of in a no-win situation there, just to kind of take it in a different direction. And I thought Brett did an excellent job talking about, teams that were excluded. You talk about like the 2000 Miami team, the 2004 Auburn team. Personally, and I'm not suggesting that they should have been the number 4 team, but I genuinely feel sorry for Central Florida. I mean, they did everything that they were asked to do. They went 12-0, and I just think at some point, the idea of, what more do you want them? I realize that, yeah, they didn't play as difficult of a schedule, but it kind of turns into, almost an impossible accomplishment for any of these other conferences to even get a seat at a shot at the title when they've done everything that they were expected to do. They went 12-0, they won their conference championship, and they're not even getting a shot. So I think the next round of with the college football playoff, and let's be honest here, it's not going to change next year. For all of the people that are wanting a possible expansion, that there was a reason why when that original contract was signed, it was for 12 years. The athletic directors that signed it, they're looking to kind of truly kick that can down the road for their successors to deal with. So that's not going to change. But I genuinely have sympathy for UCF and their fans because, like, as I said, they did everything that they were expected to do, and they're still not getting a shot at the title.
You bring up a great point, because I was going to finish off our segment here with asking about, teams like the UCF. I believe it was Western Michigan last year, not getting the opportunity. There was even talk about if Wisconsin won the Big Ten championship game, that Alabama still might have been able to jump them in order to get in, which I find ludicrous. If you're undefeated, how can you be left out of the playoff hunt? Brett, what are your thoughts on a possible playoff expansion? Do you think we need to go to 8 teams, or do you think, especially like this year when everybody's crying for that outrage, that maybe there's actually 3 teams that are worthy, and a 4th team really isn't worthy?
Yeah, I'd say that on expansion, I'm strongly against expansion. I'm strongly in favor of the 4-team playoff. I was even okay with the 2-team playoff, except for a few years here where it didn't shake out. I think 4 is fine, though. I mean, it includes, you're most likely never going to have a 1-loss conference champ that gets left out, and definitely won't have an undefeated champ that gets left out. But going back to the non-AQ group of 5 question, I don't think the UCF's a top 4 team. I don't think they're one of the 4 best teams in America, but I was kind of shocked that they didn't really get any attention at all in the top 10, top 8. You look back at teams like the TCU teams, the Utah teams, under Meyer and Whittingham, the Boise State, a whole decade of Boise State teams. They were at least talked about. They were top 5. Even if you look at 2009, TCU was 1 second away from being in the BCS championship game. The Texas-Nebraska Big 12 title game, where they actually put a second back on the clock. Nebraska had the game won, but Mac Brown got an extra second. Texas wins it, or else TCU's going to that BCS national title game. So to have Western Michigan and UCF really just buried, I mean, when you're talking 15th, 16th, you're not even close. So what do you do with them, though? I really don't have an answer for you, because I don't think that they're a top 4 team. Usually these teams that come out of these conferences aren't. So it is a tough question, but I would say keep it at 4 until the day comes that all 5 Power 5 conference champions go undefeated and a true undefeated conference champ is left out, then I'm on board with just 4 teams. Because again, this year actually showed me a reason why we should keep it at 4, in my opinion. Both Ohio State and Alabama had some pretty glaring issues resume-wise to me, and I was okay with either one of them not getting in. So until that outrage comes up for me, I'm totally fine with 4. Because to me, the most important thing in the sport is really that regular season where every Saturday matters, every matchup matters, rivalry weekend matters. If not, you're talking about the old kick 6 play that really wouldn't have mattered. It would have been for seeding. You maybe bench some starters if you're Alabama that game. So who knows? I just don't want to ruin what we have with the regular season.
I'm going to respectfully disagree because I've always been in favor of an 18 playoff, and then that's just me. Everybody's got a different opinion on this. I will agree this. I don't know if this is the year that says why we need to have an 18 playoff. I just like the idea of an 18 playoff, if that makes any sense. So maybe I'm straddling the fence here. I don't know. But I've always felt like you can have an 18 playoff and still have a good amount of value to your regular season if you're giving out auto bids for your 5 conference champions, you're giving 1 spot to your highest group of 5 conference champion, and then you got a couple of at-large bids. So even if you happen to lose your division, you're still playing for something along the way, or if you lose your conference championship game, you still have to impress during the course of the regular season if you're leaving it up to a selection committee to decide whether or not you're one of those 2 teams that deserves that at-large bid. So, I know maybe it's a tough sell for some people, but that's just where I come at. That's why I feel like you can still add value to the regular season and what each game means by even if you expand the playoff. But this year 4 teams seems fine to me. I don't think I would agree. I don't think UCF was a top 4 team. Would I have liked to have seen them match up against one of these teams? Yeah, I definitely would. So that's why I'm looking forward to seeing what they do against Auburn. But I can't say that UCF deserved a title shot this year, considering the teams that are in there. I just think that those teams that are in there are probably marginally better than what UCF is. Not to take anything away from them, but I don't know. I don't know. I think that this is the 14 field right now this year seems fine to me. I can't say that there's so many more teams that have to have a national title shot this year, but it'd be interesting to see it expanded, I think.
All right. Well, before we go, Brett, you want to go ahead and let people know where they can find your stuff and your triple option podcast and everything?
Yeah. So you can find us on Twitter at Pick6Previews. We have content on there, every day, every hour, pretty much, especially this time of year with the coaching carousel heating up and bowl season. We had the Triple Option podcast going weekly, doing our predictions, but I guess that takes a back seat now. We'll wait for a couple bowl season podcasts coming out and then the playoff preview. So, yeah, at Pick6Previews.
How about you, Kevin?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Kevin on CFB. That's where I'm usually the most active there, and I talk to you guys as well. So you can also check out my website at no2minutewarning.com. That's the number 2. Also check out thecomeback.com, and of course, like Chip, I've been doing some stuff for Athlon Sports. My playoff team got eliminated last week, so I didn't have anything to write this week, but I'm sure I'm going to have some stuff with the bowl previews that are coming up too.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us and taking the time out of your busy schedules, and maybe we'll have to do another show here next week or the week after and talk about the bowl games coming up.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, same here. It's always good talking to you guys.
Yeah. Thanks for joining.
One is a riverboat gambler using his gut to make his picks. The other is cool, calculating, and scares Vegas. This is the Silver Bullets game prediction segment. Who are you going to ride with? All right, it's time for our Pick'em segment, and I know everybody listening are like, "Why Pick'em segment? There's no real game. There's no games this weekend." There's one. There's in my heart, this is the second greatest rivalry in sports. That's just because I'm weird like that, and this is something that's very special to me. And I love the fact that this gets its own day. It's, the game that gets it's whatever you want to call it. I mean, you've got young men that are getting ready to go and put their lives on the lines for the country and all the pageantry and everything. This is on my bucket list of games to go to. We've got the Army-Navy game coming up this weekend. I'm just going to lay it out here and like this. I mean, we looked and had Army here in town against Ohio State, and they look pretty good. I forget what their record is off the top of my head. They broke the streak last year. I don't think, I'm not even looking at the spread or the wins and losses in this game. And there's a very good possibility that Army is probably favored and probably should be favored in this game. But I'm going Navy. Go Navy, beat Army. Chip?
Well, Shannon, I have to tell you, I'm right up there with you in terms of on the bucket list. Attending this game, not only, for just one time, but I'd like to actually attend it for both, from the Army side as well as Navy side, regardless of, who wins or who loses when I eventually attend it. I will tell you that my father, he served in the military. He was in the Army, but out of respect for you and, how passionate you are, I'm going to go with Navy here. It's just more of just a gut instinct call. Congratulations on winning you came out ahead, by winning 6 games. I see no reason for us.
Yeah, we're not over because we have the bowls to do.
Okay,
we're not going to crown a winner yet.
Okay. So I was premature there.
Yeah.
Prematurely.
Well, me, I'm just going to throw caution against a win probably with these bowl games because it's not like we're going to sit down and figure them all out. And I'm just going to be like, that.
All right. But I'll go with Navy out of respect to you because the passion that you have, for your previous service can do nothing but respect that. So I'm going to go with Navy also. Well,
I appreciate that. And, I'm sitting there thinking when I hear you talk about, visiting from both sides for the game, and my dad's former Army and love him to death. So it'd be kind of cool to take him in order to be on that side, but at the same time, it'd feel kind of dirty. But, in all honesty, it was kind of fun before the Army game. I had a lot of fun with a lot of the Army fans that came, and I almost had a handful of them because, former military, it's just in our blood to be drinkers. Thankfully, I've moved away from that, but there's a handful of times where I almost got them to say, go Navy, beat Army. So, I mean, and you're in September getting fans and you're talking about the Navy and Army game, having a great time. There's just something special about it. And I kind of wish that Air Force and Army and Navy, they get more pomp and circumstance. But I mean, you have the Commander's Cup and everything like that. But it just, for some reason, the Air Force game against either Army or Navy just don't seem to be on this level. Maybe it's just because of the tradition and the history behind it, but it's definitely going to be a fun game to watch. And just one day, I hope to be there. All right, Buckeye Nation, that's going to do it for this edition of the Silver Bullets podcast on the Ozone Radio Network. Always a sad time for this. Want to say thanks to Brett Ciancia of Pick Six Previews and a Triple Option Podcast, and Kevin McGuire of NBC College Football Talk and No2MinuteWarning.com. That's his podcast, and he's on the comeback, and he writes for Athlon Sports, which, Chip, that's you. They can find your work, and where else can they find you at?
Well, yeah, they can find my work on Athlon Sports. Shannon, you referenced the article I wrote about Ohio State being excluded from the playoff. That's where that's located. I do contribute to Hayes and Cannon on theozone.net. I can be reached on Twitter at Chip Minnich, Minnich. So for those of you who completely disagree with me about the idea of an 18 playoff, let me know. For those of you who agree with me on an 18 playoff, let me know. For those of you who say, hey, you were completely wrong with your Ohio State article on Athlon Sports, or you're completely right, no matter what, just let me know what you think. It's always great to hear from our fans of the articles that we write and the podcasts that we record.
Definitely. You can find me on Twitter at ShannonCFB. You can find the show on Twitter at SILVR Bullets Pod. You can like us on Facebook, Silver Bullets Podcast. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can subscribe and listen to our show on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and Spreaker. Thanks for listening to our show as always. And don't forget, just because, it's not really the off season, but we have the bowl games coming up. We're going to have some great guests for our bowl games and stuff like that. And we got a early signing period starting for recruiting. So get those questions into us. Either hit us up at silverbulletspodcast at gmail.com, or use the hashtag #AskSilverBulletsPodcast. And, you can send us a DM on Twitter or a message on our Facebook, page. So with that being said, I want to say again, thanks for listening. Love your guys' feedback and everything like that. And go Bucks.
Go Bucks.